So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for the Educational Research Department Seminar series. We are delighted to have Troy Heffernan with us here today. I'll just get a few instructions before we jump into the seminar. So just so everyone's aware, the seminar is being live streamed, and that's for our postgraduate students, for staff, and for other interested people who can't join us live right now. You can ask questions, and we would love for you to do that. If you would do that at the end of the seminar, that would be wonderful. You're welcome to post your questions in the chat, and we'll come to those. Either I can ask them as the chair, or we can ask them yourselves if you'd like. The session will also be recorded, and the recording will be available on the department website and on our YouTube channel in time. I would like to remind you as attendees just to switch off your camera and to mute your microphone during the presentation, so there are no interruptions for Troy. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. So Dr. Troy Heffernan is a senior lecturer and Fulbright scholar at the University of Manchester's Institute for Education. His research examines higher education, administration and policy, with a particular focus on investigating the inequities that persist in the sector. And we're delighted to have him with us today for his talk entitled Fighting for Breath in the Modern University, Surviving in Inequitable Settings. So I will pass you over to Troy now, and without further ado, let's jump in.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that introduction, Jonathan. When we first started talking about this, I think Jonathan probably contacted me. It was definitely in 2022, but everyone has a very busy schedule, and it took this long to get to this presentation. But that has actually given me a really long time to think about what I was going to talk about. So you've all read the abstract, I assume. So this is something that I had been thinking about, and it's something that is based on some of the work I've been doing over the last couple of years. But this presentation is also brand new. There's no reused slides or recycled material here. So this is kind of where I feel that I'm at with my research sort of in May 2023. So obviously because of that, I'm also not exactly sure how long this presentation is going to go, other than my sort of 1 or 2 practice run-throughs. But we'll go through and we'll see how we go. So what this is really about, I think the abstract gives some indication of sort of the issues that we're going to talk about. But down at the bottom of this slide here, I've got the 2 main points are really how universities got to where they are in 2023. Because I think that's really important to understand or appreciate in terms of thinking about where we are today and what that might look like going forward. Because nothing happens in a vacuum. Where we are in 2023, even with COVID, is extremely predictable. Obviously, what happened with the pandemic is not predictable, but I and many other people, it's certainly not my idea, would argue that how universities responded to COVID and what that meant for students and what that meant for staff, it was predictable in how universities would respond. So a majority of this work does come from a book that I published at the start of 2022 called Budget and Higher Education. This book look, I know people write books in different ways, but I'll be completely honest and say the seeds of this book started in 2018. So it was a fairly long process between starting to plan and research and write this book and having it get out there. So it really is probably the culmination of 4 or 5 years of work. And a majority of this presentation involves Budju and what we can learn using his thinking tools to understand what's happening in universities. But at the same time, I have a new book coming out at the end of this year, which is sort of currently already drafted and peer reviewed and sort of in production, called The Marginalised Majority in Education. And I'll be using some of that material and some of that research as well as we move forward. So a starting point for this presentation is probably more a warning or a situation or some acknowledgement of where I'm coming from and what I'll be talking about today. because obviously as a researcher, my own experience plays a fairly strong role in how I feel about things. But the starting point here is probably that I'm not the first person to think this way. So a lot of what I talk about today will be in relation to what I've seen happen in Australia and what I see happen in Australia compared to what happens in some of the sort of major other research areas, higher education areas, which, you know, are predominantly Canada, North America, and of course the United Kingdom. But I think Australia has gone so far down the road of neoliberalism that people in Australia don't really appreciate it. People in other areas don't really appreciate it. But this isn't new information. We've known this for quite some time. Lou Zippen's work, who's American, from the sort of early 2010s, even the early 2000s, and John Smith's work and his pivotal book, the introduction of those works, Lou's paper, John's book, all point to the fact that Australia can really be a warning for what other countries could experience. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. So one of the reasons I think there's always this confusion is it's so easy for people to say every country, sort of those main countries are all sort of facing managerialist operations and corporate universities, and they're all engaging in neoliberal practices. And that's absolutely true. But I think where the difference is what engaging with those practices actually looks like. So in my limited time in the UK, what I've seen sort of is the same as what I experienced in Australia. And I could certainly say that I've seen the same sorts of issues around workload and performance. But in sort of in opposition to that, it was so much further down the road in Australia in a way that it really couldn't be pictured to what I've experienced so far in the UK. So while Lou and John talked about that, just to talk about some of my other colleagues at Manchester's work, Steve Jones put out a book last year called Universities Under Fire, and Andrew Gunn has just published a book, Teaching Excellence, Universities in the Age of Student Consumerism. I think both of these books kind of have some discussion in there about what we could look at in the future and sort of what's happening in the UK right now. And I sort of feel what's happening in the UK right now is kind of where Australia was 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago. So certainly what I'm talking about today is not unique. There is a growing history, a growing field of research in these areas as people sort of come to further explore what it means to be a marginalized person or even just a privileged academic in a university space that's changing rapidly. So to talk a little bit more about myself, but mainly in just the context of what that means for this research, it does become difficult to sort of separate what you've experienced to what you read about. But I think my own sort of how I've operated in Australia and the places I've been are significant in the context of this presentation, because a lot of it does talk about what's happening in Australia for the sake of being a warning to what could happen in the UK. So I've been at 4 universities in Australia, and those universities really covered the spectrum of what wealth and privilege can look like in a university space. So I worked at 2 universities which were regional universities and 2 universities which were part of Australia's group of 8 university system, which is sort of their equivalent to the Russell Group universities. Just because this makes a difference to funding and teaching and approaches to research, certainly working in those different environments really gave a good indication of how different focuses can augment what people are doing and what people are asking for you. But at the same time, I think arguably I worked at one of Australia's poorest universities, and conversely, I've also worked at one of Australia's richest universities. And obviously that means significant differences in how people talk about things, but at the same time, the pressures were still the same. And I think that's kind of a nod to the fact that neoliberalism has taken over everywhere, but what it can look like is slightly different in varied settings. So I moved to the University of Manchester around this time last year, actually. So I've only had 1 year. And obviously, I think it's working in one university does make it difficult to make judgments on what's happening in other universities. From talking to people at Manchester, I also, it's very clear that what goes on in the education faculty is completely separate to how people feel about the university operating in different disciplinary areas. But some of the direct comparisons that can be made and some of the obvious differences that we can look at, and I will look at in this presentation, the things that really stick out. So there's obviously the response to COVID. Australia had a very strict response to COVID where universities were concerned, and I'll go into more detail about that. But it certainly had issues around funding and how people were funded and what funding was happening and which universities were getting what amount of emergency income. And we, of course, we fired, the university sector fired 40,000 people in Australia due to COVID. And that was not an even spread across universities. Some universities were certainly punished significantly more than others. And the other thing that's kind of stood out to me so far is the issues around control, academic freedom, and trust. And again, having only worked in one faculty in the UK, I say this knowing it may just be what happens in Manchester, but from talking to my colleagues who have been at other universities and from having opportunities to do presentations like this, which aren't always for education faculties, I do get the sense that overall, the trust that's placed in academics in the UK and the amount of academic freedom they have, and subsequently the amount of control the university has over their academics is somewhat different here. So the example that really sticks in my mind was sort of one of the turning points of me realizing just how different things were. At the end of last year, I had a report that was ready to be published for public consumption. And it started with work in Australia, but it finished with work in Manchester. So Manchester's name was on it. In Australia, at multiple universities that I worked at, if I had a report or something like that that needed to be, it would need to be approved. It would have to go through the faculty, it would have to go through management, it would have to go through marketing. There'd be many layers of people that needed to approve that report before it was allowed to go out to the world. So as I had done multiple times before, at Manchester, I took this report to my head of school and said, this is about to be published, I need to get it to be approved. And they just stared at me with a blank response because they didn't understand what I was asking, because there is an inherent trust that if you've done the research and you've made the report and you're putting the report out, that it's of a quality standard and within reason, the academic freedom is there to write what you choose to write. So that's a very personal experience, but that was sort of one of the things that really made me start to realize how different things are in the UK than they were in Australia. And this is, a lot of this is all about me, but I think that's just setting up what the rest of this presentation is going to be. A lot of what I'm talking about is what most people experience, what is sort of the average that takes place. And I think as we go along, that's something that will stick out. Certainly when we start talking about what goes on in different areas, I say that knowing that every faculty is different, every university is different, but I kind of have to speak on a whole. So if some of the things I'm saying are the complete opposite to what you have experienced in your faculty, I apologize, but I'm kind of talking in larger groups here. So why use Bourdieu? This is all sort of covered in the book, but just to go over it, just sort of make sense and why I was attracted to Bourdieu's ideas. When I first started teaching in university, I actually started in the history department. My PhD is actually in education history, and the first teaching experience, teaching contracts I could get were in the history department. As soon as I walked in, on my first day, it became evident to me that students were walking in and they had entirely different histories and backgrounds and knowledges, and you could tell that some people were walking in and they knew they were going to get a good grade, you knew they were going to succeed. And at the same time, other people would enter the classroom and it was very clear that they were unsure. Now, just as an educator, as someone would, you don't need to be familiar with a sociologist to understand what was going on here. It was very clear that there were always going to be issues around money and privilege, and that was going to make a difference. But it didn't provide all of the answers. So in talking about this with one of my colleagues, someone just said, you need to read Bourdieu. They were very honest about it and said there's probably a whole bunch of people you can read, but I know Bourdieu, he might be a good starting place to really sort of understand how all of this fits together. And for anyone out there who's thinking they might be interested in doing the same thing, this same colleague actually also gave me wonderful advice that I sort of always try to share with anyone who's looking into a new theorist if they haven't really gone down that road before. This person suggested to me, do not pick up a book by Bourdieu, do not pick up a paper published by Bourdieu first. Go through, have a look at sort of these two books I've got here, Understanding Bourdieu or Key Concepts, because these are sort of glossary books. And reading those first really sort of talked about the thinking tools, applied them to an easy setting that you can understand. And after that, going to Bourdieu is actually a lot easier. So that was probably the most important piece of information they actually gave me, because I'll be the first person to say, if I had have just picked up Homo Academicus, which is Bourdieu's work on higher education, having not read any of these other books, I very likely would have given up very quickly, just because of what they were talking about without the explanation. So now we have to talk a little bit about the history. And so there's a little bit here about the history of the university and how that relates to what we're left with in 2023. So I'll start off by saying the university itself is a privileged place. And it's really easy to sort of look back through 800 years of history beyond England as well, and look about how universities started. And I appreciate, sort of the first university in Australia opened in 1852 or 3. So this was significantly after sort of people have been looking at sort of Oxford and Cambridge. But as a starting point, universities were religious places. That's what they were for. It was for the production of people for religious positions. And of course, those people tended to be extremely privileged people, or people who had connections to privilege. Then, of course, we went to professional certification. So the obvious ones that people always think about is doctors and lawyers. But of course, more recently, we see engineering, teaching, science, maths. These are all things that to be part of the professional body, you need a university degree to be part of. So with that background, that's sort of where we end up in sort of the middle of the 19th century. Still very privileged places. Really, universities were still places for the children of the privileged. If you went to university, it's because most likely your father went to university. But then we get this turning point, and the turning point was really World War II. And so for a lot of this, I base a lot of my thinking on Hannah Forsyth's book, The Modern University. It's a fantastic book. It does trace the history of Australian universities, but sort of at least 50% of the book is dedicated to universities more globally, because Australia was always just copying what other people had done. Australia had very few original thoughts when it came to higher education policy. So the starting point really for the change is following World War II. Now, when exactly this change took place depends on where you are. So the changes that we'll talk about in America, Canada, Australia happened quite early, for the key reason that we didn't need to rebuild. There had been a cost of war, but our cities, our towns didn't need rebuilding, so we could move forward. England, understandably, a lot of places in Europe were significantly behind, so this started to happen 1 or 2 decades after. But universities started to turn to places where people were going to. We have the baby boomers start to grow up. There's more money. People are able to have luxury items. One of those luxury items is education. So partly we've got that happening. Partly we've got people needing university degrees to get employment. So all of a sudden, universities are becoming a little bit more popular. At the same time, governments see a reason to invest in universities in terms of they're starting to see that an educated population will make a larger contribution to science, which in America was important for the Cold War. But in other areas, higher educated people, albeit a stereotype, are more likely to have more secure income or higher income, which leads to more secure housing, which means to less reliance on government payouts. This was all really good for a period sort of in the second half of the 20th century. And during this time, we begin to see people start to come through. So World War II, we see a huge influx in disability in higher education, albeit mainly in terms of mobility, because soldiers were coming back from war injured and they were taking up higher education. So even though it was primarily around disability, that provided the first starting point to see more inclusive practices in higher education. So where this started to change, and there was sort of an indication on the last slide, was in relation to the financial downturn of the 1980s. And this follows a couple of decades, depending on where you are, of huge growth in universities. In sort of places like Australia, for example, we could not build universities fast enough. We did not have enough seats compared to students who wanted to attend. We did not have enough people to teach the classes. And part of that was obviously the government putting it forward. The other part was the social aspect of people wanting this education. So when we hit the financial downturn of the 1980s, two things start to happen. And there are two things that started to happen that remain true in a lot of cases today. So the first is the financial accountability. Previous to this, as I just said, universities couldn't be built fast enough. Governments were investing in universities, investing in research. Universities were still largely unconnected to government or commercial enterprises. They were still largely operating with a large amount of freedom. With the financial downturn, this started to be taken away by governments in various ways. Most notably, universities became more accountable for the funding they received, which is sort of the first steps to seeing academic freedom start to be taken away. Universities have to be teaching content that's government approved. You start to see people not be allowed to teach the beginning of critical thought if it's critical of what the government's doing. Even if it's just seeds, this is where we start to see this take shape. At the same time, the government starts to take advantage of how society thinks about higher education. And this happened in two ways. So the first one is that society had really started to get on board with higher education because higher education was seen as the pathway to an easier life, a guaranteed career, going to college equaled employment. When the 1980s the downturn came, that was sort of one of the first things to go. People started to see that this wasn't a guarantee anymore. And universities losing that guarantee was hugely detrimental, and it's one they've never really gotten over. And I would argue that one of the reasons society hasn't gotten over that is because governments have made sure that society feels that way. I think governments don't like it when people have control over what's going on. If everyone in society wanted free education, wanted free higher education, wanted accessible higher education, wanted research funding to be made, wanted universities to grow and be able to do the work they did, governments would have to fund that and you wouldn't have a choice in the matter. What we see for a lot of people is that governments have kept higher education essentially teetering on a seesaw of government support or not. And I think the clearest example of what this looks like in practice is when we saw COVID happen. So in Australia, COVID came, governments were bailing out private building companies, governments were bailing out mines, government were bailing out all sorts of industries. Governments in no way, shape or form provided any money. They in fact took money away from universities and no one said anything. And the reason no one said anything is because government members, politicians, prime ministers were more than happy to do press conferences and say, Universities don't need to be funded. Universities need to shrink. Universities are a luxury item. We don't need to be funding people doing PhDs on poetry, which is an incredibly simplistic view of what happens in a university. But after decades of that being the approach governments took, every single person not connected to a university just nodded and said, yes, that's fair. Let 40,000 people lose their job to make sure that private industry is still funded. So that might be a critical view of how things have taken shape, but that's sort of also the experience that I have had. So ultimately, what this means is we see universities shifting towards a business model. Sort of in the last couple of decades, and certainly throughout most of the 21st century, universities are now competing for students. There are fewer students than there are places. This means people have to invest in marketing. So depending on the size of your university or what's around you, universities are obviously spending millions of dollars a year on marketing and making sure students are happy through means that aren't necessarily connected to teaching or learning. We'll talk about funding a little later on, but grants and funding are sort of in the same situation. Certainly no longer are universities funded heavily. Funding is being reduced. As I said before, funding is being tied to other avenues. Research funding is the same. People are becoming increasingly competitive to get this funding. The funding's shrinking. The number of people offering it are shrinking. And yet the prestige you get from acquiring these things are essentially a necessity for your future employment. So what does this mean in practice? So the next few slides are more of a top-down view of what's going on. And it's sort of just to give an overview or a shape of what universities look like. So a couple of years ago, I did a study with vice-chancellors from Australia, Canada, and England. And these are kind of the main points that really jumped out to me. So the first one is that universities are no longer a group of scholars led by scholars as they were for so long. And some would argue they were even sort of in the very, very early years of the 21st century. This is still what was happening in at least some places. But that's not really the case anymore. The Vice-Chancellor is really leading a business. Most of the people talked about the fact that what they were really doing is gauging competition. They've got competitors, depending on what university you're at and where you're located. You might have local competition, some people have international competition. That's what they're really doing, because this is about money, this is about public relations. And they were very honest about that. Some of them weren't happy about it, but that is the role. And this last point here that I've written, this is why career VCs have emerged. Certainly in the beginning, historically, the notion of a vice-chancellor was somebody who had been at the institution for several decades, who knew every mechanism that happened in that institution in regards to who was there, how it operated, what the research strengths were, what the teaching strengths were. And vice-chancellor is a position that you would do for the last 3, 4, 5 years of your career before you retired, to sort of guide the university and use your existing knowledge to help the university move forward. Now that we've moved to a business model, and that's not really what vice-chancellors are about, we see the emergence of career vice-chancellors. So one of the things that we happen to see is we had people reaching their first vice-chancellorship in their early 50s. Multiple people across this study were on their 3rd, 4th, or 5th university as vice-chancellor. And this, of course, is sort of evidence of the fact that this isn't really about being a community of scholars. If you're on your 5th vice-chancellorship, this is about your ability to do what the university needs you to do in terms of finance moving forward. And this also leads to a very clear and obvious problem that I found, but I didn't really think about it until somebody pointed it out to me. And that's the fact that if you have someone in a career position, if you have someone who's in a vice-chancellorship and they're looking to move on, how do you move on? What's the gauge to move on? Well, the gauge to move on, the criteria, that how you're measured in your work is likely going to be how well you ran that university economically. And as critical and as cynical as it sounds, the answer to that question is usually that they've been able to make the employees they have do more work for less money. I know that's a highly critical review, but I'm going to say that's kind of what's happening when people are reaching their 5th vice chancellorship in the space of 2 decades. So if we move down a little bit, we move down to deans. So this is a very holistic approach to heads of school, deans, faculty deans, however you want to look at sort of that middle layer of leadership. And I know that people don't like it when we talk about this. I've certainly done presentations where I've talked about this work before, and certainly during the 2020s when people were losing jobs, people don't want to hear any sympathy whatsoever towards any dean and what they're doing. If you're connected to people losing their jobs, that's kind of it. And I appreciate that, and I fully get that. So this is more of just a overview of what a dean's role currently is. So the first point is really that a dean is a brick in a wall. And I think that's really important, because if you are not in this space, and I see the same thing happen when people do school research and talk about head teachers, there's always this view by people who are sort of not connected that the school head, or the dean in this case, has a dictatorship and has control over what's taking place, and it's their decisions. When of course that's not the case. They're really just one part of the puzzle. There's people above them. They might sometimes have some choices in what they do, but ultimately their job is to deliver what people above them have decided. And nowadays that increasingly, not always, but increasingly means they don't get to have as much to do with teaching or learning as they want to do. Part of their role now is to execute a business plan. Now, this will obviously be different depending on faculty, depending on your university structure. But I think this next slide kind of sticks out to me as something that when the person said this to me, this is kind of what really made me understand what was happening in universities. And I won't read it out, you can sort of read it, it's not very long while I talk, but I think this is sort of the notion of what has changed here, of someone whose original job, at least in their experience, was purely dedicated to working with staff, making sure the students had the best experience, making sure what they were doing was increasing the research capacity of their faculty in the best way forward, to work within the university, work within the research climate of education, who then at the end of their career, and they're about to retire, they're currently still working, is in a situation where they're just working with spreadsheets. So it's almost as they viewed it, a complete 180 of what their original job was. So the role of the dean is really to take instructions and deliver what's been decided for staff. So it's the conduit between management and staff. And so even though they're different, we kind of do see the connections here between BCs and deans in what they're doing, what they have to do, and sort of being corporate citizens to what the university wants. And I will say that this dean, one of the other things they said that really stuck to my mind, and I've not had a position where I've had to deal with the sort of power that a dean has to deal with and the issues a dean has to deal with. But they said to me, the day you become dean is the day you have to take off your academic hat and become a business person. So again, that's just their experience, but that's sort of, I feel like an element of that may be true for most people in this position. So the landscape has changed, and that has made a difference for the people leading it. And it, of course, makes a difference for academics working in it at all levels. So we're starting to get pulled now in different directions. And I know we always were, but I think it's becoming a lot more important now to be able to successfully operate in these different areas. So research is obviously hugely important. But what does that actually mean? So that means something different for people in different countries. So for example, in Australia, the way our research excellence, our ref equivalent worked, was essentially based on quantity rather than quality. And I say that in terms of, yes, there had to be some quality there, but your contribution to research was based not on anyone ever reading your work. Your contribution was based on the journals that work was published in. And I think we can all agree that sometimes some low quality work can get through into very high quality, quote unquote journals. So that's how it was measured in Australia. It just mattered where it was published, what the impact factor was. That's how your success was gauged. So that is kind of in complete opposite to what I've so far experienced with REF, of which, of course, I'm only at the very beginning of my REF career, but I see now that this seems to be much more about research quality and the potential for international impact or worldwide impact, with perhaps a less focus on just how much of that research you're putting out or what journals they're being put into. We also see funding play a much more important role. And this is a strange one to me because I do spend a lot of time working with students, and they're sort of in a similar situation here of there's a prestige that comes with funding and scholarships. And I think what's interesting is for social scientists, and I can't speak for everybody, but I do think there are times when people are applying for money, not because they need it, but because funding success and grant success is now part of most people's promotion applications. Every university I'd worked at in Australia and Manchester, I mean, this is publicly available information, I'm not revealing secrets. Funding is part of your promotion application. Funding is part of getting off probation. It's part of making sure you're doing a satisfactory job. So inevitably you find people applying for money for the prestige rather than for the need. Scholarships for students are sadly the same. Gone are the days when applying for a scholarship is something you did because it was the only way that you would be able to facilitate learning in this environment or getting into university. Now scholarships are given to whoever applies, and lots of people are applying for scholarships who don't need them, but there's prestige attached. And I'm sort of particularly susceptible to that one right now because I sat on the Manchester scholarships panel last week and I was kind of blown away by who we were giving scholarships to and who we weren't. And so it's also meeting the demands of consumers, students. So this is something that people will feel differently about. I have my own feelings on this, partly because of the work I've done with student evaluations. But again, Andrew Gunn's book explores this in detail, and that might be a starting point for anyone who has any different views on that. So really what we're doing is meeting the needs of the business, but those needs have to be met if we want to move forward. I will speed things up a little bit because this is taking longer than I thought. So the landscape has changed. There's not enough jobs. We know there's not enough jobs. There haven't been enough jobs since around the 90s, depending on where you are. That's when we really hit the shift from not enough people to fill the jobs we have to too many PhDs being produced. And at the same time, the fact that we've gone to this business model and that people can be highly picky in who they select, and there's often hundreds of applicants for a single job, people don't have time to find their feet anymore. Gone is this idea that you would finish your PhD and then maybe you would get a postdoc or a RA job and sort of learn how to become a researcher and then get a position. I think for most people, you're not getting a permanent job in academia anymore unless you've already got that solid research base behind you. And of course, this is because we're working in a corporate sector, and this can catch many people out. So we'll talk about this a little bit later on. But I think this is really important because certainly I sort of remember as I first started in the university, I had no conscious awareness of the fact that we were working in a corporate environment. I just assumed it was another educational institution, and having had experience with schools, I was surprised to realize just how corporate the environment was. So who gets to succeed? So this is really the second part of this presentation. And this is where Bourdieu really comes into his own in terms of providing that groundwork to understand what happens in any social setting. But of course, in this situation, I'm applying it to higher education. And I've just got that asterisk there to again reiterate that what I'm about to discuss is really about what it looks like in a larger group. A lot of Bourdieu's thinking tools were to apply to sort of communities. So it's not about individuals. And if your own experience in no way matches this, I apologize in advance. So we know that universities are privileged places. So what that really means is, to put bluntly, universities are there to benefit white, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied men. And anyone who doesn't really fit that description is going to find themselves at a disadvantage. That disadvantage will be a different size depending on what disciplinary area you're in, what university you're in, what is the social context where your university is located. These things all make a difference, but it will make a difference to how people succeed. So when do academic careers begin? If you wanted to read Bourdieu and go right into detail, Bourdieu would tell you that we can start making predictions about someone's academic success before they're born. But that's probably not a helpful way to look at this today. So we'll think about academic careers as something that takes shape as people enter undergraduate study. So Bourdieu tells us that the second someone walks into a classroom, we can start to see their academic success, their potential academic career start to be determined. And this is because universities are inherently privileged spaces. So again, for the sake of what will happen in most scenarios, in most university classrooms, the class is going to be led by someone who's middle class, someone who's probably white. When you walk into that room, if you match the person who is leading that class, if you match most of the students in that class, you are probably set up in most situations to potentially be more successful. It's not that you will fail if you don't match that, it's that you will be always one step ahead. As I've written in some of my other work, there's a tax involved in being from a marginalized group, and that tax is never extinguished. It might be a different size, but it's always there. So once you've walked in, it's all about relationships. So in undergraduate study, you walk in, who's in the classroom, who do you get to work with, who do you talk to? This is about stepping stones. If you walk in and you've read the same book as the lecturer, that they happen to be reading casually, or you've been to the same places, or you know the band that's on their shirt, these are all connections that Bourdieu would tell us are in one way, shape or another related to privilege, related to capital of the person leading the room. But this builds relationships. And in undergraduate study, it is about who you're familiar with. Are you going to be familiar with the lecturers? Are you going to be familiar with the students who are likely to do well in that class? Now that's important for academic results, but it becomes much more important when we start talking about people beginning to filter through to an academic career. So I've made a difference here between coursework and research, but they're kind of the same. So if you're in undergraduate study and you're thinking about postgraduate study, who do you get to talk to? Are your friends also doing this? Are you able to talk to the lecturer? Has the lecturer encouraged you to do this? And I think this becomes much more clear when we look at research and potentially PhD supervision, because this really relies on connections to be made. If you are at the university where you want to do a PhD, this is about people identifying you, asking you if you want to do a PhD, you feeling comfortable to be able to ask people if they will supervise you, if they have ideas about how to move forward. So this is all about relationships. Someone might know who you are and that's great, but if this is someone you've been talking to regularly since the first year of your undergraduate study, it sort of stands to reason that you'll have a potentially easier run into a PhD if that's what you would like to do. And I mean, but the same is true if you want to apply to a different institution. There's research out there from the big universities in the UK who it's not uncommon that a lot of people apply from outside of their institutions. The interviews that you have as part of that is hugely important, and it's perhaps predictable that if the person conducting the interview is from the same background as the person applying, a stronger connection is made, there's a larger potential that the person will be accepted into the program. So even without that multi-year connection there, it's about connections, it's about relationships, because relationships are rewarded, as we will see when we talk about beginning an academic career. So I think we all know this is probably the experience of most people here. Your academic career probably begins with RA work, research assistant work, or teaching experience. Now, I did both of these things before I got my first full-time position, but Bourdieu tells us there is a huge difference in who gets RA work and who gets teaching work. And this is all about privilege, and this is all very predictable. So first of all, RA work is probably the preferred work to get future employment, because for all of universities being about a business model nowadays, research is still the main capital that will be rewarded rather than teaching excellence. That's changing in a lot of places, but I will say for most places right now, research is still the key to progression. RA work is also personal work. So it's RA work that's likely to go to the person who has the closest relationship with the lecturer, professor who needs this work done. It's because they know each other, it's because they know they'll have to work together, because they know each other, they probably have a larger knowledge of the person's research experience and what they can do. They're happy to work with them because they know them, they're happy to work with them. So this is work that is really based on a relationship. Teaching experience is less about that, and to use Australian colleague Gail Crimmon's words, teaching experience tends to be about filling gaps in workloads. And it, of course, has flow-on impacts into what jobs someone might get after. But these two jobs together are still going to be impacted by money, life situations, and other situations that people might be involved in. So money is probably the clearest one that impacts on both. Who is more likely to have not been working and is able to take up RA work or teaching experience? Someone from a middle class, more stable financial background. Who is more likely, if they were working, to stop working to take on this work? Again, someone who's more stable financially, who has more of a safety net. But then, of course, it's also highly gendered. Who has the ability to put in this time for research work? Who has the ability to be able to teach classes with no control over the timetable? Obviously, this tends to be men. It tends to not be people with family or care responsibilities. So again, we begin to see clear trajectories here of who's going to succeed. And as we move into further employment, that's where these connections really come to fruition. The strongest connections lead to the fastest employment, tend to lead to employment in the research space, because the employment the step before was research work. The lesser connections will not stop people from getting a job, but is more likely to come from teaching experience and end up in a teaching-focused position. This has clear consequences to career progression, career security, leadership positions. Again, I put another asterisk partly there just to remind myself. Most universities also have an out for this, because universities know what they're doing. There's no fooling anybody here that someone who's been employed on a teaching-focused role has a real option to get moved into a teaching and research role. When people say things like you can do research to get yourself out of that teaching focused position, when's that supposed to happen? If you're teaching an 80% teaching workload and then having admin on top of that, the only time there is to get the research done that's going to get you out of that position is in your own time. So again, we see universities put out targets that can't be met within your workload, but if you meet them, you have met this by using your own time, which the university has still benefited from your research. And again, I hope that isn't the experience of most of the people here, but it's certainly something I've seen happen in multiple institutions. So this is all about privilege. 2023 looks completely different to what the landscape looked like in 2003, let alone in the 80s or before. But the impact is still the same. There's still a clear group of people who are going to be privileged moving forward. People are going to have different experiences, and we can predict what those experiences are going to look like. And we know that universities reward privilege at the whole time, partly because this is how universities have been shaped for 1,000 years. And certainly even until sort of the later part of the 20th century, that's still how they worked. And another issue that Burju love to talk about is the fact that merit doesn't exist, and merit is just in education to hide or disguise privilege. For all of the things that we've talked about today, you could always say that it's connected to privilege. Who gets the research job? The person who has the research history. Why did they have that research history? Because they were given the RA work. Why did they get that RA work? Because they had a good relationship with the lecturer when they started. So it's one of those things where it's hard to question merit. It's hard to question giving the job to the person with the most successful research agenda. But again, we know that behind that merit is just the seeds of privilege. So what is the answer? And I am coming to the end now. I know I've already run quite a lot over. The desire for change. So I've put happened pre-COVID here because in my work prior to COVID, when I was primarily working with staff from marginalised backgrounds, we were seeing universities start to make some really good steps forward in more inclusive practices and starting to change policies. And it was really good. It was really heartening to see that people were starting to do that. But things don't always work out as planned. And of course, COVID happened. So the first thing that I'll say about COVID is, and it's sort of in the next slide as well, prior to COVID happening, a lot of what was happening to support students from marginalised backgrounds were in support services. So we were getting them in, there was support services to help them, to make sure they succeed, to get them through, so that they were essentially never alone. It was an acceptance that was a different experience for people from marginalised backgrounds, and there were support services in place to help them through. In most universities, if they had funding cutbacks due to COVID, those support services were the first things to go. And on a more global scale, we know that even though student numbers dropped across the global sector of higher education due to COVID in 2020 and 2021, people from marginalised backgrounds dropped off at a higher rate than their peers. So they needed that support. That support was there. We'll talk about it more in the next slide. Obviously, this wouldn't have mattered if there was systemic change rather than support services, but at this point, we'll make do with what we have. So another answer, of course, is to get marginalised people into the circle of power. Bourdieu always talks about the circle of power. University management is a circle of power. The circle of power is not about being in the majority. The circle of power is, in most cases, actually the minority who have the power to control the people below them. And it's very easy to say the sooner we get people from sort of the primary marginalised backgrounds into the circle of power, the sooner things will change. And certainly to a level that's true, but I will sort of go back to a few slides ago when I mentioned that one of the people I used to had worked with said when they became dean, they no longer became an academic. And I think we're starting to see research that suggests that's very true of the circle of power. People from marginalised groups, albeit in the smallest number, and this may be what this is about, are coming into the circle of power essentially to be stripped of the individualism that they hope to bring to the position to make systemic changes to improve the situation, to improve the landscape for those people coming up behind them. But that's where this really all comes to here. It's about making systemic changes. Making changes because of money, making changes because of funding is brilliant. And it's one of the things that people like because it can make instant solutions. Making any sort of systemic change that takes hold, it doesn't matter how long it is, but it's always going to be an elongated process. If you can use money to fix the solution today, lots of universities do that, and that's brilliant because it's an instant success. But then that also lets them not have to make those systemic changes. And then, of course, the reality here is that while we're operating in a corporate environment, the success is going to be limited. So when we talk about higher education, administration, and leadership, so much of the literature begins its infancy in business, finance, law. For all of what we're trying to do, there is still going to be a question of money here, going to be a question of people getting value for what they are trying to do, people working with ever decreasing budgets. Again, for all sort of my earlier criticism of vice chancellors and deans, we wouldn't be in this position if universities were better funded. But while we're in the situation where that funding is not particularly adequate and is shrinking, these business type practices are going to continue and they're going to impact on some people more than others. And just my last slide here, I know the previous slide was a little bit of a downer, but there are successes. And these are just some of the work that I've been doing, the successes I've seen. So some of the other major work that I've been doing has been around student evaluations and what that means for people's being hired, fired, and promoted. Go and have a look if you want to find that work. But the essential overview of that is we know now, and we've known for a long time, that student evaluations are not good for anybody, but they're particularly harmful to people from marginalised backgrounds. So I've had the opportunity to work with universities in Australia, England, America, about changing those practices. And that's been really good to see those changes happen. And of course, part of this is also about what universities want to do. We've seen enhanced student support services, despite the fact that I just said that's not quite the ideal method. We have seen universities reinvesting in student support services, and that's brilliant in terms of getting students back into the classroom, making sure that they're going along nicely, that they're equaling their peers in terms of completions and graduation. This is really important. The same is true of disabled staff and students as well. We're starting to see some really important changes be made that's better for people working in universities and for students operating in universities. But my final point will be, a lot of this is about what universities want. Whenever I've walked into a university who has wanted to change, they have changed. If a university wants something to improve, usually if someone can offer them a very clear path forward, they are more than happy to do that. I think for researchers, a lot of what we have to do is provide those solutions, and that is not easy. A lot of the questions I deal with, people have been asking for 40 years at this point, and none of the recommendations have sort of been applied and worked in a way that's been able to lead to wide-scale change. So that's where we're at right now, really, in terms of, I think universities becoming much more willing to listen to people with ideas to improve the setting, to make places more inclusive and diverse, but they're really looking for people to come with solutions that will work, and that's quite a difficult thing to do. So thank you very much. I know I went a little bit over, but thanks very much for listening.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Troy. That's brilliant. Okay. I'll put my camera on as well. There we go. That was wonderful, Troy. Really enjoyed that. Loved hearing about your work and getting us to really think about the purpose of higher education and scoping out that trajectory over time, but also kind of into the future as well. So we've got time now for some questions, and if people would like to either put them in the chat, I'm happy to read them for you, or if you would like to jump in with a question. If you want to raise your hand, I can then identify who's asking questions. Is there anyone who'd like to get us started? Okay, perhaps maybe just while people are thinking, can I just ask a question and use my privilege as chair? You mentioned at the beginning, Troy, about kind of Australia's trajectory being slightly different to other parts of the world, and you feel kind of like a little bit further along in this neoliberal trajectory. I just wondered why you thought that was the case. Given that it's further behind, its higher education system started some centuries after other parts of the world. Why is it that you think that it is so far advanced in terms of those kind of neoliberal trends?
That's an excellent question. I think part of the situation there is that people, sort of as I tried to talk about, people see the same things happening in other countries, and seeing the same things happen in other countries prevent you from appreciating exactly what's happening in your own context. So nothing that I've seen so far in my time in the UK has been particularly different to what I saw in Australia, but without experiencing both, I wouldn't understand exactly how different they are. But I guess the other part of it is probably funding. Once Australia made this turn, and this is an Australian academic, Jill Blackmore, who has for a long time been in this space. She could outline this and explain this far better than I ever could. But once you've had sort of 40 to 50 years now of the Australian government removing funding at a faster rate, it's also become very clear to me in a very short time that there are significantly more research funding opportunities in the UK than we had in Australia. For most people, the only option for funding in Australia will be through the Australian government's Research Council. These things have pushed people to operate in a very clear way. And once sort of the funding's gone, once we're talking about university restructures, which in Australia were happening all the time pre-COVID, let alone when COVID started, it has really been a situation, an environment that has made people work in a certain way. And that certain way is non-stop. Whatever you do this year needs to be topped next year. Your successes are only relevant for 12 months. Look, that benefits the university immensely. But if it's the only environment you've ever known, that's how you work. So for me, I think that's probably the situation I stepped into as a PhD student, was that knowledge that whatever you did will need to be topped the next year after. And that's just how my birth into higher education happened. That's how I thought it worked. And I think at this point, that's how a lot of other people feel too.
Thank you so much. Tony, I think you put your hand up. You happy to ask a question?
Hi, yeah, is it okay to come on video?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, please do.
Hi, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks very much, Troy. That's absolutely fascinating work. It's new work to me. I'm an applied linguist. I'm at the University of Reading in the southeast of England, and we use Bourdieu in our work as discourse analysts, and we look at things like the linguistic market and linguistic capital. And I just wondered if you've come across any of that kind of overlap of disciplinary boundaries, where some of the things that you've been talking about have been investigated using any of that focus on language or discourse.
Look, I'll be completely honest and say the answer there is no. As you would well know, I've sort of had conversations with people who used Bourdieu's work around journalism or real estate. And I think for me, it was interesting, someone actually earlier today sort of said in a critique of my work that you're doing nothing to advance the field of Bourdieu. And that's a valid point. I'll be honest and say I'm not. I'm using Bourdieu's thinking tools to understand higher education. So my answer there is no. I've essentially picked up Bourdieu's ideas and just applied them to understand the work that I've been doing, which is an oversight on my part.
I don't think it is. I think we're all trying to apply the tools that Bourdieu's provided us with to sort of look at our own particular fields of study, aren't we? So it's not. I'm not identifying gaps in your research at all. Just opportunities maybe to collaborate and look at ways that we could draw from other fields, because the kinds of marginalized backgrounds obviously has a linguistic dimension. How students, how staff in different parts of universities talk about their work, how written language fits into their jobs is all quite interesting. So somebody's put something in the chat about work that does that. So I'll have a look at that and I will drop you an email to follow up. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Lenandor?
Thanks. Hi, Troy. Thank you for your presentation. I joined late. The funny thing is I was reading and writing a little bit about exactly some of the things you talked about in my thesis. So in a way, I feel like I'm in the right place, and I feel like maybe I'm doing the right sort of thing. So thanks again. My work is an early career academics researchers, as you might know. And I know you didn't focus on that, but there are a couple of things that prompted me. And just a quick one or two background thing. I was in a meeting the other day with some other grad students, and in the US, I was appalled at the number of applications. Someone said they sent as many as 80 for jobs, and that's mighty scary. what I'm reading in the literature about early careers, researchers, academics is very scary, and I wonder about the future. Now, there's something you said about about change. The question that came to mind is if early career academics now are being raised in this sort of environment, when they get the chance in 10, 20 years to be those new VCs and deans and so on, what might they be thinking about the kinds of change that needs to be made? And so when I see the literature, all I'm seeing is this ethos of publish more, get the next thing, just business like, and I worry. So if you were to look into the future, into your crystal ball, what might this landscape look like in 10, 20 years for early careers then, and even those who are early careers now, when they become leaders? I don't know if I'm grappling there with some issues with clarity of what I want to say, but that is what I was thinking. So I wonder if you had any thoughts about that. Perhaps that might inspire me to complete this PhD I'm working on, or just give it up. Thank you.
I think, first of all, if you and we know each other on social media and have for many years, as someone working on a PhD about this topic at this time, you are probably better positioned than I am to have detailed knowledge of what's happening in the literature today. One thing I will say, just for the sake of transparency, is I obviously entered academia pre-COVID, and one thing that has, I think, is quite stark in the last couple of years, as much of a journey as it was for me to get out of precarious employment and into full-time employment. And I appreciate what you said about people applying for jobs. I've long said that one of the largest files on my computer is my failed job applications folder. As tough as it was for me in the late 2010s, I can't imagine how difficult it is for people now. But that's 2023, and what is it going to look like moving forward? So I think a lot of this will have to do with government funding and the way universities want to go. So potentially it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. One of the universities I was at in Australia got a new dean while I was there. And in that process of getting a new dean, one of the people who were floated as a potential new dean was a senior accountant at Deloitte with no history in education whatsoever. That didn't come to fruition, but I think the fact that any university had made the decision that that might be a suitable way forward to lead a faculty may be some indication that for some people things are going to get worse before they get better. In terms of 10 or 20 years, I think we need to look at how funding's going to change. It's, you're really asking me to make a wild prediction. Hopefully, I don't really know how much worse things can get. We're also in a quite unique situation in an education faculty of many people have the option of leaving and returning to the classroom if that's their original position. Not every faculty has these options. I'm certainly seeing people in Australia, it had really picked up that people were walking away from potential academic careers and instead going back to schools. But that's not going to be the same for everybody. So I think it'll depend on government funding, it'll depend on institutions. I hope to see that it improves for people from here on in, but I don't think that'll be the case for everybody. So I know that's not a particularly good answer, but I think there's no one out there who's really claiming that we're in a good situation right now. But I hope that most people can be positive, even if it's going to take a couple of years for things to improve.
Story. John, I know you've got a hand up, and I'm going to go to Ty, who had a question in the chat first, if that's okay. Ty, do you want to ask your question, or would you like me to read it? I'll read it. So it says, hi, Troy. I have a methodological question about how we actually study or understand the university as an object of inquiry. How and why did you decide to take your slice or analysis from the perspective of senior leaders, and who is the university in your mind?
Oh, that's a good question. Part of that is not to advertise my own work. A couple of years ago, I wrote a paper that is in Higher Education Quarterly, which is called Examining Higher Education Through Find. It's 2020. It's about fields. I should have thought harder about what it was called. But in that paper, I think that was just a case of, that was to answer that question is what that paper is about, in terms of, it became the situation that my focus originally was always on what was happening to staff and what was happening to students. And then it sort of became the situation that you couldn't talk about what was happening to staff and students without talking about deans, and you can't talk about deans without talking about DVCs, and you can't talk about, and so on and so forth. Budger knew this, and it sort of results in these field maps of just 50 different fields overlapping and entangling each other. And even then, when you start having different discussions, what you're going to pull from each field is different. So I know that's not really an answer. That's kind of like a few sentences that have covered a 6,000 word paper. But usually, like, the answer is, what I envisage as the university is really what I need to take to answer what my direct question is. And the reason it's like that is in that paper.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Troy. Got time for a few more questions. John, do you want to ask yours?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I suppose I'm basing this on having worked in universities for over 40 years, which is roughly the sort of period that's covered through the paper you've just given. I'd like to sort of offer a comment and then a question. The comment is, I was really pleased that at the end you had a slide which was in a way saying some of the successes, that was the good news. Because I do feel sometimes we really beat ourselves. And if I think back over the 40 years I've worked in universities, I actually personally think there have been some significant areas where things have improved. You know, I look back at times when I sat around in examining meetings where people just sort of decided, oh, well, we'll give a first to that person and a 2-2 to somebody else, and so on, often without any sense of accountability or reasoning. I can also remember resource allocation, where basically it was all done through by a vice-chancellor with very little knowledge necessarily of the detailed needs of particular departments and so on. So I think I think it's good to look at some of the positive changes as well as pointing to some of the more negative changes that you highlighted. My question is really, to what extent do you feel that in some of the developments, especially the move towards more competition and so on that you highlighted at the start, to what extent you feel that universities themselves and academic staff themselves have been complicit within that sort of change, that sort of shift? And just as background, one of the things that I've done some work on were the origins back in the 1980s of the move towards research assessment, the RAE, that's now REF, and so on. And looking through some of the documentation at the time, especially papers of individual universities, CVCP, and so on, it's very clear that much of the pressure for a more selective allocation of funding came from the universities themselves rather than from government. And many of the, I would argue, many of the other changes that you sort of highlight actually some of the universities wanted those changes. They weren't just imposed from outside.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just interested in your thoughts about the role to which universities and individual academic staff are sometimes complicit in the changes that you've highlighted.
Mm-hmm. I think you are absolutely correct in terms of some universities have actually asked for these changes. The one that really sticks in my mind is how the research funding is allocated in Australia. Australia has 38 public universities. 8 of them are in the sort of Russell Group equivalent. Those 8 universities successfully campaigned to make sure they had a larger piece of the pie, which of course left every other university with less to fight for. So the very privileged group of universities wanted that because it benefited them, and they had their arguments why that was the case, and their arguments in some versions of understanding were accurate arguments. Large, wealthy universities had most of the research funding, so it should just be given to them, so they shouldn't have to fight for it. So yes, some universities absolutely have campaigned for wanting different methods that the government has been happy to do. And the same is really probably quite true for our staff members being complicit in what has taken place when it comes to competition for students. Sometimes by choice, I think. Sometimes the fact that people engage in that behaviour, I think a lot of the time is really manipulated by the university in terms of what people want to see for promotion in terms of student satisfaction. Just to talk about the one slither I know about in detail, when people want high student evaluation scores. We've known for a long time, it's not me knowing, people have been writing for 20 years, that student evaluation scores are really just primarily, more than anything, measures of customer satisfaction surveys. And some people know how to get good customer satisfaction surveys. Whenever I've talked with universities, including in my own higher ed research group, and we talk about removing potential student survey impact on promotion or probation, coming off probation, there will inevitably be some people there who put their hand up and say they don't like it and they don't think that it is warranted. And of course, that's because they are people who get good evaluation scores because they are, and I say this knowing exactly what I look like, white men in a suit who are predispositioned to get good evaluation marks. So no, you're exactly right. There are certainly, it's not all about the terrible government or the terrible university leaders. There are people in there who are actively doing things to benefit themselves.
Super. I think we've got time for at least one more question. I'll read this one out from Adam Matthews, unless Adam, you want to read this yourself. Okay, thank you. So he says, interesting talk, thanks. What are your thoughts on public stroke national policy and institutional corporate autonomy and how that balance might change? There's also a comparative question there, which you did with the UK and Australia. So what are your thoughts on the public stroke national policy and institutional corporate autonomy and how that could change?
Ooh.
It's a big one.
I think that institutional autonomy is, okay, so to go back to Lou Zippen's work. So I really enjoy Lou Zippen's work as a starting point. Lou Zippen's work from the early 2000s, his main argument, and I think he was making the same argument in the late 1990s as well. His argument is that universities need to return to full autonomy and they need to go back to how things were in terms of they received government funding. It was ample government funding. It was up to the university to work out how that money was spent. Now, please remember that if you're not familiar with Lou, Lou is American and was protesting in university protests and sit-outs in the 1960s and 70s. So that's his background. John Smith would tell you that that's fantastic, and that would, that is a utopian goal. but that's an unrealistic expectation in this situation that we currently find ourselves in terms of universities will never go back to being a community of scholars led by scholars, independent from government and business interruptions. So I would look, the dream is that universities return to autonomy and leading themselves, which opens up the ways for those leadership teams to return to be people who were scholars and are doing work to make sure that the best teaching and learning outcomes are happening. But if that's not going to come, we need to think about what the balance is going to be. And at this point, I can just sort of picture if we're going to have situations here where universities are underfunded, and if they are going to be forced to operate in more business-like practices, it's going to be that accountable funding that's always going to be there. And if there's accountable funding, it's always going to have a strong impact on what level of autonomy a university can ever really have.
Great. Thank you so much, Troy. That was a tricky question to end with, but I think you dealt with that and the other questions really well. And the presentation certainly was, as our kind of tagline says, food for thought. I think a fascinating foray through the kind of the landscape of higher education at the minute and where we're headed. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much for doing your seminar today. We really appreciate you giving your time, and thank you everyone for coming. As he said, we're recording this, so this will be available in some weeks or months down the line. But thank you so much everyone for coming, and our next seminar is going to be on the, sorry, D, I should have got this in advance, shouldn't I? On the 16th of May?
17th.
17th of May. And D, sorry, just remind me, because I don't have the details directly in front of me.
It's Helena Brankovic, Faculty of Sociology, Bielefeld University. And the title is Performance Comparisons, Rankings and Organizational Status Competition in Higher Education.
Thank you. I'm on my tablet because my computer stopped working. Okay, thank you so much. So we really look forward to seeing you at our next seminar series. Troy, thank you again for a wonderful seminar, and look forward to seeing everybody again in the future.